Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our technology roundtable conversation today. My name is Carla Watson, as head of the Jake Scavel Graduate Teaching Fellowship, and I am delighted to be able to host and moderate these three wonderful people in the room today. I know some of you are still coming in and joining, but don't worry, the session is being recorded, so if you do miss a little bit, not to worry, you will receive the links for the start that you might have just missed in the beginning. We've got three phenomenal speakers today, and I would like to ask them first our traditional question at JGF, which is, who is your favorite teacher and why? After that, I will then let you know a little bit more about the work that each of them do through their own voice. We have some videos lined up for each of the speakers to be able to have their work speak for themselves. But to begin, let's kick off with you, Rob. Tell us, please unmute yourself and please tell us, who was your favorite teacher and why?
Thanks, Carla, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. What a pleasure to be with inspiring young teachers ready to change South Africa. So my most inspiring teacher, I went to a very traditional all-boys school in the southern suburbs, and it was not a particularly good fit. Would be a oversimplification. But I had my art and design teacher was a gentleman called Andrew Putter, and Andrew Putter on our very first day sat down and said, "Guys, my job's not to teach you anything." And I was like, what? Does that mean that we all get free time? And then he thankfully continued that sentence and said, my job is to create the environment to help you to learn how to learn and to create a love of learning that will last you a lifetime. And the way that then manifested in a subject like art, where I'm thinking like, how on earth is that going to work in art? The very first thing he said is, guys, I need you to work collaboratively and set your own first project. And then we had to figure out how to self-organize ourselves. We ended up realizing that it's just chaos unless you select a facilitator and a chair. Then we set the parameters for what the project was going to look like, and then the assessment of what success would look like in that project. And then we went and did our work, and then we actually peer reviewed each other's work at the end. And it was just like this wonderful illustration of what's possible in the teaching and learning environment, where kind of breaking the mold that a teacher's job is to stand in front of you and to convey information. He was just so way ahead of the curve. So Andrew Putter, hands down.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. Corrin, let's hear from you. Who's your favorite teacher and why?
Thanks so much. I actually grew up in Australia, and my favorite teacher was my year 6 teacher, Mr. Brandon. And it's funny how all these years later, and I'm still friends with him, if you can imagine, 30 something years later, and I still call him Mr. Brandon every time I see him, which is very awkward. But he kind of inspired the sense of exploration in me. So we would have slideshows, and he would have gone on a holiday to the Galapagos with the Maasai in Tanzania, here in South Africa. And so he actually was giving me a rundown of what was happening in South Africa during that transition period, even though I was a grade 6 student. So I think he drove that acquisition of knowledge, that hunger that I had to explore, to see what the world was about, and to see what I could go out and do as some good. And I think as an inspiring figure, particularly at that age bracket, it's really important. So Mr. Brandon, if he's out there, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Corrin. Ma'am, Mokhudu, tell us, and you're allowed to say yourself, tell us, who is your favorite teacher and why?
Okay, I actually have 2, but I'm going to start with this one. It's my former high school principal. He was a male principal, and I just came to the high school as a brilliant child. I was promoted to the next grade to do my grade 9. Unfortunately, when I was about to do my grade 10, the same year I was promoted, I fell pregnant as a teenager. And he was the most heartbroken person. And I remember he came home to encourage my mother to support me. And I think he is the only person who believed me then, because the time I was at school and I was pregnant, I was supposed to be expelled, but he allowed me to write my exams. So the next one was my English teacher, Mem Sijeng. Oh, I didn't say the name of my principal is Mr. Ramotwala, PM. And then my other teacher was Mem Sijeng, the teacher who taught me English at high school. So she was teaching in such a way that I admired her. And we are still friends even today. So we share a lot of things. I admired her then, and I still love her now. During my top 10 finalists, she organized the announcement for me at a very prestigious place on her expenses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mokhudu, and thank you, Rob and Corrin. And the reason we asked this question is because neither of you have mentioned anything about the subject matter. Teachers play such an interesting role in how we experience the world that often it is beyond the subject content that really stays with you. And we ask this question because regardless of your background, regardless of your lived experiences, somebody comes to mind about who impacted you positively and why. And all the students in this room who are becoming teachers will be that person and leave that impact in other people's lives. So thank you for letting us know about the impact of teachers in your own life and in the esteemed aspect of your career. And like I promised at the start, instead of my voice explaining who's in the room, we're going to let the work that you do, Rob, Corrin, and Mokhudu, speak for itself. So I've got 3 videos lined up. We're going to start with you, Mokhudu, and have your video presented. Give me 1 second.
It's very crucial for me to be a teacher. I have lives of people bestowed in my hands. I need to unleash their potential. I carry that every day in my heart. My name is Mokhudu Machaba from South Africa, Limpopo. Most of the parents here just put their kids to school because there's nothing they can do at home. When they feel they no longer want to come to school, they drop out. Hence, we have a high rate of drug abuse in South Africa, alcohol abuse, teenage mothers. Most of the learners here, almost 70%, are not academically gifted. We need to find a way to make them complement each other. And hence I have introduced project-based teaching. The Marula project came because we have the Marula tree in the yard. The tree was facing a threat of being cut. Now we decided to brainstorm with the learners. What can be done so that we sustain the tree? Those who are academically gifted, they can go and make the research. Those who are not good, they can collect the fruit, do the work with their hands, then we can do the counting. So they are engaged in learning.
It is not only a scared tree, it is our heritage.
Solving the challenge within the schoolyard has given them a lot of new skills. Critical thinking, creative thinking, collaboration. They are proud to have their indigenous knowledge implemented in the classroom. This is the digital age, and if learners are not competent with their peers globally, they will find themselves left behind. I'm teaching them simplified versions of coding. If you find somebody stuck, then you need to make them get unstuck, because you'll be learning more and more and more. It's fascinating for them. They love it. When they have finished and they have come to the end of a level, they will go say, yay! I had a very painful past. Being a teenage mother, I didn't get to know my real father, but I'm grateful that it was like that, because it built character in me. I can engage the parents, interview the parents, get to know the child from the home setup, so that I can match that with the school setup. Because I cannot teach the child before I can understand the child.
Most of the projects here at school and in the community coming through Mokhudu. She goes extra mile. Now we have got the students that are doctors. Some are at the university, they are learning, they are going on with this ICT.
I was doing grade 8 when I wrote 200 stories, and she told me that there was this competition. She said I should enter. Then that is where my confidence started, because she had believed in me. I created a blog because I wanted to use what motivates me to motivate other young girls outside. I want to rise beyond my background and become an impact to the community, just like her.
Just being a teacher, it makes me the happiest human being on earth. Interacting with people every day, changing the lives of the people around me. They mean a lot to me. I'm a lifelong learner because of them. I think I was made for it somehow. I didn't know until I experienced it.
Mokhudu, some of the comments in the chat is saying, I might have seen this video 3 times and it remains as inspiring. Thank you for the work that you do. We're going to, yes, ma'am? Yes, oh, hard back to you too. We're going to learn a little bit more about some of the work Rob Paddock does. Also equally as inspiring, but a different flavor as we follow our own passions in education.
There is no doubt that we live in 2 South Africas. The one South Africa is represented by the top 3% of schools. These schools are well-resourced and together have more learners achieving distinctions in mathematics than the remaining 97% of high schools in South Africa combined. The other South Africa is represented by the majority of schools in our country, where learners' academic abilities can span as much as 5 grade levels in one class, and where out of 100 children who start school, only 6 will ultimately achieve an undergraduate degree. Sadly, the gulf between the 2 South Africas is widening, yet the fate of all South Africans is knit together, and our future success depends on narrowing this divide and educating our people. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the many problems which have plagued our education sector for decades, this is a time for bold action. And this is a time to revisit our fundamental assumptions about where and how learning happens in South Africa. It is against this backdrop that we announced that the University of Cape Town is launching an online high school with its first intake of learners in January 2022. The UCT Online High School is more than a school. It's the backbone of an ecosystem which has been designed to service South African learners from a broad range of socioeconomic means. This ecosystem includes an entirely free online school platform with an interactive curriculum for any teacher and learner to use. The most affordable private school in the country offering a high-quality education. A series of blended learning micro schools for learners who need the safety of a physical space, as well as access to reliable hardware and internet connection to complete their studies. In the future, a series of bridging courses, matric rewrite programs, and alternative university credit programs to provide learners with new pathways to achieve tertiary awards. As a university starting a high school, we have had the opportunity to reimagine the learning process from the ground up. Together with our partners at the Valencia Institute, we find ourselves unburdened by having to do things the usual way, which has allowed us to design a high school which can deliver quality education at scale. Some might say that launching an online school will further exacerbate the divide that already exists in our country. But this is not just a school, it's an ecosystem that will enable an entirely new generation of quality, affordable online and blended learning opportunities for learners around the country. True transformation can only be achieved in our country if we enable every learner to receive an education that prepares them to succeed in school, university, and life. The UCT Online High School is a key component of UCT's Vision 2030 and gives effect to UCT's massive transformative purpose to unleash human potential for a fair and just society. So join us as we embark on the exciting journey to introduce new possibilities into our education system. For more information about the UCT Online High School, please visit uctonlinehighschool.com.
Again, a video that speaks for itself. Rob is integral to the initiative of UCT's Online High School, and we're going to hear more about that. And I'm sure there are some burning questions. The chat is on fire. And Rob, get ready for a bunch of questions that are coming your way when I give you your first prompt. But first, let us have a look at some of the incredible work Corrin is doing as well.
Here's a thought. What if there was a world where an easily accessible, outcome-driven digital content solution was available to anyone, anywhere in the world, with over 1,000 curriculum topics and more than 35,000 animations, videos, and interactive activities? Now there's an idea. Welcome to Idea Digital Education, a world where every student has the same educational opportunities as each other, regardless of nationality, gender, or age. But we don't just provide you with access to technology, we help you personally transform that technology into learning. So what does your future hold? At IDEA, we will ensure that you have the best in core foundational education to help you achieve these dreams anywhere in the world and at any time. Because Hassan in Malaysia, Umbali in South Africa, Olivia in Australia, Nicole in the Philippines, and Philippe in Rwanda are all facing the same challenge: better access to global education so they can perform to their full potential. IDEA is at one with you. And the results speak for themselves. Our secondary school students improved by over 35%, and our primary school students increased their numeracy and literacy by 28% on average. So wherever in the world you are, IDEA is here to ensure you get access to global education and achieve your full potential. In 2020, we are up to the challenge, bringing you more local curriculum and more global best learning goals than ever before. Welcome to a world of possibilities. Welcome to the world of IDEA Digital Education. Register online and start your IDEA journey today. Go to ideaonline.com to learn more.
Thank you, Corrin, for your work that you're doing in the space of online education as well. Now it is clear, everybody, what brings us together for this technology roundtable, particularly with Drake's Cable Fellowship's theme of disrupted education, and what does that look like? Part of JGF's vision is supporting 3 pathways to impact: expert teacher, educational leader, and social entrepreneur. And each of us has the privilege of all 3 of those pathways in the room with us today, living and achieving a vision that aligns with what they want to do. We're going to kick off with the first question for our panelists today, but I want to invite you to use the chat, team. Use the chat for questions, interact with each other, and learn as much as you can from the people that are available to us for the next 40 minutes. My first question, and I'm going to direct this to Rob because he had an unforeseen event coming up, so he has to drop off a little bit earlier than planned. My first question to you, Rob, which I'd then like to hear from Corrin in response, comes from our Professor Jonathan Jansen, who is the chairperson of our board. And he goes, he places great value on the importance of digital pedagogy as part of our fellowship program, so that our students are equally comfortable to engage with students in both a face-to-face and online environment. In his mind, there will be future disruptions that will place a premium on teaching this skill set. In your experience, and of course with the work that you've just launched, how do you think enabling powerful learning outcomes differs in an online environment?
Carl, it's such an important question. And I think the starting point for me always when thinking about any educational intervention is what is the context of the learner and what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve for that learner. And I know that sounds like such a simple thing to say, but we forget it time and time again. We have this kind of global idea that if we just build this one thing, it's going to be suitable to all learners in all circumstances. It's just like, no, not realistic and actually not going to be particularly effective. We need to start with the context and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for those learners. So then if we work backwards from that, and let's say one iteration, at least in our context, could be learners that are currently living in Mitchell's Plain. And when we think about that from a UCT online high school perspective, the answer clearly is not just let's just deliver an entirely online learning experience to that learner, because we're not taking into consideration the context in which they find themselves in, which is that home is not a particularly conducive environment for many learners from that community. And so we need to be realizing that at least one of the primary functions that schools perform for many learners from those sorts of communities is as a safe harbor from the very harsh realities of home. So the idea that learners still need to come into a physical space, at least to my mind, is paramount. Then we start to ask ourselves the question, okay, so if they still need the safety of a physical space, how can we help to alleviate some of the other challenges that exist in schools that are in those areas? So as an example, a lot of our country's best teachers, unfortunately, don't continue to live and work in the harshest areas. And this is not an indictment on any teachers. Teaching is an incredibly tough and noble profession to start with, but often they'll get absorbed into the formal Model C system, or they might even go into the private school sector because they pay better and the environment is easier, quite frankly. So one of the things that we need to think about, and that I'm certainly have been hell-bent on solving, is how do we continue to provide learners in contexts like that with access to the country's best teachers? And for me, digital presents a clear opportunity in order to do that. So then if we take it one step further and we say, okay, now learners have got the safety of a physical space, they're connected in digitally to teachers who can be located around the country, living wherever they live, and they're still having direct engagement. How can we make the learning process even more efficient? And so then for me, the next thing is we can start to move very quickly away from the idea that the role of a teacher is didactic instruction, i.e. I am the purveyor of content knowledge to you. And we can start to use the role of teachers rather in terms of remediation, in terms of timely interventions, and critical roles such as pastoral care and so on. That warmth and that richness of a human connection with it, which I think Mokhudu just so beautifully illustrates, and I think so many of us aspire towards when we think about the teachers that we want to be. So in that context, how do we think about leveraging technology in a way that can create more efficiency in the system, so that precious teacher time can be focused where only human time can be used? And then I guess the last layer, sorry, two more layers. Another layer on that is we've got a challenge in our education system where there's not enough transparency as to what is happening in the classroom. And this for me is a huge problem. My previous chancellor used to speak about the black box of education. Learners go in, a teacher goes in, something happens in the classroom. And if the output is great results, then happy days, we're all happy. If the output is bad results, then we kind of scratch our heads and say, I don't really know how to diagnose what happened there, and it's too late. And now the learners have got like a 6-month or 1-year gap in their content knowledge, and this issue can compound. Real-time information about how learners are progressing, about whether our teaching and support staff are doing the work that they're meant to be doing, is fundamentally enabled in this digital environment, but you have to build it from the ground up as such. So certainly that's a big one for me. And then finally, if we come back to the context of a learner in Mitchell's Plain, in one of these micro schools, they still need adult supervision. They still need the care of someone who is in person with them, an inspiring adult figure who's physically present with them in the classroom. So for us, we've made this distinction between the role of a teacher, which I think is incredibly bloated in its job description. I don't know any other job in the world where we would be asking our professionals to do 17 individual tasks and 17 in discrete competencies, and have to do them simultaneously every day, all day, and expect them to be able to do a good job across all verticals. It's just like that. That's just patently insane. So at least one of the things that I've been very adamant about is we need to disaggregate the role of a teacher into its component parts and rethink how we put that together with multiple professionals angling in. And one of the ways that we do that in our learning model is that teaching and learning takes, in terms of the academics, takes place from a range of different individuals virtually, but a mentor is physically present on the ground, whose role is not to provide academics, whose role is to be there as the warm, empathetic, caring individual who shows interest in you as a person and is from your community, can build that sense of trust and inspiration. And it's working. I mean, so we've got a micro school in Mitchell's Plain that is achieving astonishing results. And that's the correct, at least by my estimation, the correct implementation for a learner that finds themselves in that context. It's a very different solution for a learner who finds themselves in a CBD like Santon and wants to study, and maybe then a fully online solution is appropriate. So again, we need to start with the context of the learner. We need to work backwards from that to figure out what is the appropriate use of technology, and then how can we thoughtfully integrate and deliver that to the learner.
Oh, Rob, Corrin, I'm coming to you in a second. I just want to catch on one or two things that Rob has mentioned before he steps away in a second. I just want to highlight some of the information that you've shared here with a strong focus on the context of the student. And as a teacher myself, I completely agree, and any teacher would agree that it begins with the lived or the experience of the student before you can teach them anything or try and advance their space. There is a question in the chat that I'm quite curious to bring to your attention, Rob. The one is, Bojroko asks, the move to hybrid learning environments and easy access to information has impacted the nature of assessments already. They'd be interested to know, how would the UCT online school be assessing learners in this current context?
Such an important question. I think that as we move into the digital age, whilst this is a question that is contextually relevant to an online school, I think it's more indicative of where we are in the knowledge economy. The idea that the assessment of learning is about the ability to retain facts and regurgitate them under examination conditions is just not setting our learners up for future success. What we need to be focusing on in terms of our assessments is the application of knowledge. And so the way that you think about actually constructing your formative and your summative assessments, from my perspective, needs to be based on that. In addition, for things like high stakes exams and so on, we do have remote proctoring systems that we use, which are actually incredibly sophisticated in this day and age, which can ensure academic integrity and authenticity amongst our learners. But nonetheless, I think the principle is more important. Let's move assessment away from, I read I read some information and now I'm going to, my job in the exam is to repeat that information. Like we're missing one of the most important factors that education can provide, which is the ability to engage critically and to apply knowledge.
Absolutely, Robin, and supporting what you're saying around assessments. And then, Corrin, I'd like to hear your feedback after this, which is, how would the UCT online school develop the whole person? Because we know schools and schooling is beyond assessments and subject content knowledge and the exchange of information. So things like creative arts or sport, what's the strategy or anticipation in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that I'm really thoughtful on is that when any system becomes too complex, it becomes incredibly inefficient. And I think that as a industry, or shall we say as a sector, education has become this kind of monolithic creature that tries to be all things to all people. And as a result, we're getting less efficient. And so I mean, as an example, in South Africa, we've got the second highest percentage spend of GDP per capita allocated to education, and yet we've got some of the worst outcomes in the world. We've got to have pragmatic conversations about the trade-offs so that we can achieve what we need to achieve. And in my mind, one of the primary functions that we need to achieve is allowing our students to excel academically, and then to think differently about how we might solve for the other challenge and the other challenges and opportunities that exist in education. So as an example, for us, in addition to the academics that you will receive in an entirely online environment, we've got a whole range of virtual clubs, societies. Some of those are student driven, some of those are driven by our teachers and mentors. We have localized meetups for learners who live in the same areas. We've got the same for parents. We then have a network of sports clubs, art drama societies, etc., that we are linking learners into and saying, if this is your particular interest, then let's help to facilitate that. But we don't necessarily need to do all of that, because our number one priority is to make sure that we help you to succeed academically, and then importantly, develop you as a whole human in terms of the pastoral care that we pride ourselves on. So that's in terms of the kind of socio-emotional development, psychosocial development of our learners. And we actually have dedicated psychologists and ed psychs who are working with our learners on a regular basis, and their impact is phenomenal because they're doing nothing but that all day, every day. So yeah, I think maybe, Carla, I'm probably answering in a broader context than you asked the question in, but I think we've got to consider the role of education in our country, because our current system is not working. Like clearly it's not.
Rob, I really like that. I really like your ability to practice or demonstrate a sense of innovation, where what I'm hearing you say is too often too much responsibility is held on one aspect of a sector or an industry, and rather, forgive the word, but diversify how this impact is managed and how it can then support the whole person in the classroom and teacher.
Completely. And maybe if I could just say one more thing, I think that there's an unreasonable expectation that's currently being placed on our schools and on our teachers. I don't know how, particularly in under-resourced areas, how we are meant to pull a rabbit out the hat. I mean, to be clear, Mokhudu, you are one of the sorts of inspiring figures that I think that we can all look up to, but there's not enough of you. And I think that that it takes a large amount of exceptional humans in this current system to be able to create change. One of the things that I'm fairly hell-bent on driving is we need to have broader conversations about the system that is education and what needs to be prioritized, what doesn't need to be prioritized, what is the thoughtful inclusion of technology into the system so that we can actually deliver quality education at scale. By 2030, 45% of the global youth population will be on the African continent. We've got the fastest growing youth population in the world, and we don't have the budget to build enough schools, to train enough teachers, so we better start thinking about doing something differently.
Wonderful. This is really about disrupting education and leading innovation. And thank you, Rob, for your insights here. It is a precious privilege to be able to have direct access to you. And I understand that you might need a drop off quite soon. So, Corrin, I'm coming over to you with the same prompt, which is off the back of what Rob has shared. What does this blended approach between face-to-face and online learning look for the context of the child from your perspective?
Sure. So I think it ultimately comes down to the transformed role of the teacher. So we need to determine what that role is. And I think that we also need to then support it from a professional development point of view. I mean, we work in a slightly different model, which is that we work with government or public schools using whatever infrastructure the departments have put in and trying to leverage that to really optimize within the school so that we can see this integration of technology with teachers. But it's very clear that we're replicating the pedagogy. So we're replicating non-digital pedagogy straight into a digital environment, and COVID seems to have taught us nothing. I mean, essentially what it did was a perfect opportunity for us to show how can we actually rethink what learning and teaching looks like in a lockdown or shutdown situation. But what we did was we just took the same pedagogy that's not working for us currently, and we either replicated it through basic platforms, or we didn't provide anything at all. Worksheets were going out. Worksheets. I mean, in the 21st century, we're sending out worksheets. So, you know, I think a big part of what we need to start to see is that we are seeing infrastructure going into our schools. So the digital divide is closing from an infrastructure and hardware point of view. But even if, let's say, we reach this utopian dream of having all the devices we can possibly want to access, do we understand our various roles with how we're going to use it in the education sector? And the answer is no. So what happens is we see these huge device dumps happening all across this country and across the continent. And then we're not coming in behind and supporting teachers in how do they create that environment, which means that they can actually give technology some of the responsibility for content mastery, for some of the imparting of knowledge, and they can become facilitators of learning. And I think that kind of wraps up what Rob was saying as the role of the teacher, but we see it as a facilitator of learning. And if we can start to see that facilitation happening from teachers, we then see these sorts of figures of around 85% of teachers at the moment are said to be working unsustainably. They're working unsustainably because they've got more work because of technology, not less work. So we ask the question, are we actually creating those efficiencies with technology, or are we just creating more work and less outcomes? And I think we have to connect that the teacher should feel comfortable to hand off certain parts to technology, but that is ultimately around a changed role of the teacher, not a diminished role.
But on Corrin, I'm hearing from you an appreciation for the load teachers carry. And the teacher in me appreciates that. And using technology doesn't necessarily mean that you can move forward. In fact, you need even more support and more of a sense of comfort for using technology as a broad term in the pedagogical context. Now, Mokhudu, your lived experience to this point is exactly that, being a change maker and a change leader, using technology to advance the experiences of the people around you in terms of colleagues or students. And Corrin touched on quite a bit about a concept of device dumping. So whether we sent all those devices to your school, Mokhudu, it still might not have the level of impact that it can. And to bring in Rob's point earlier about the context of the student being quite important, I'm hearing a sense of the context of the teacher being just as important too by leveraging technology in the pedagogical process. So Mokhudu, what would you see as most, and now this is a little bit off script because these things have a flavor of their own. What do you see as a helpful way of enabling teachers' sense of comfort or sense of confidence leveraging technology in the classroom?
Good afternoon, colleagues, and Carla and Corrin again. With what my colleagues have just indicated, I think they have said a mouthful. You spoke about the dumping of gadgets at schools, which is practical. I've personally experienced that, wherein you find that a private sector will offer schools the gadgets for the learners to work, and there is no support for the teachers to use those gadgets so that they can help the learners. Now they are stuck. Learners would want to use them, but now again, the school policies are hindering the progression and the development of the learners, because you find that in a school, learners who are very conversant, maybe from home, they do have those gadgets. And I am, as a teacher, I'm still having a technologic fear. So now I'm hindering those learners by implementing the policies to make them not touch those gadgets while the teachers are not there, and that is not helping at the same time. And Corrin spoke about the replication of pedagogy, wherein we are taking the traditional way of teaching and trying to digitize it. And in any way, it's not helping, because now we are looking at the fourth industrial revolution, where we need to prepare our learners for the world that they will live in. So if you check what is happening in the world today, we have so many graduates in our communities that are not working because they are now irrelevant, and there are no programs in place to make sure that how do we redefine what they did to match the standards of the economic process in their environments. So it's a big challenge. And another thing that I can maybe point out is the issue of leaders who are rigid. We have young minds with a new expertise. Instead of using those people to implement new ideas and to train them and support them on how they can work with the new trends in education, we are trying to implement our leadership policies, how things are done. They need to stick to that. So there's also a conflict between the other generation and the other generation. We are not completing one another, and we are not collaborating to work towards the goal. And with my personal experience, again, what I have experienced personally is wherein you find somebody eager to work, eager to implement new things, but in a way, that particular person who's eager to work is put aside, because now he is coming as a threat towards those who are in power and don't want to change. Thank you.
Mokhudu, I really appreciate your voice coming out saying the aspect of rigid leadership, which to some extent can be quite allergic to innovation, and vice versa. And one of the prompts in preparation for this conversation today, and I'm coming to you, Corrin, is how is technology shaping the sociocultural assumptions around education that have been held for more than a century? And Mokhudu's touching on this quite significantly, in being in a context where change is uncomfortable and innovation is uncomfortable, which is why we need to disrupt and to some degree and question the status quo. At JGF, we have an organizational value that says we work from the edge of the inside. And Corrin, your work seems to be focusing on that. How does your work enable innovation in a way that encourages from the edge of the inside the disruption to happen? Whereas with Rob, his work is quite a macro influential approach, whereas you're working in the schools in existing contexts to make change. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, so I think, part of our frustration is there are excuses made in terms of the use of technology in education. So we always blame either connectivity or devices, or really they're not insurmountable. So we should be seeing them as part of the digital divide. We understand that. We certainly saw over the last 18 months how the best that we saw under leadership of innovation technology was radio lessons or television lessons, and we saw governments pushing towards those because they understood it. But again, it was teacher facilitated, lecture-based lessons that were on outdated technologies. And so when we think of advanced technology, we always think of expensive gadgets, right? We always think of that we need to have lots of data, but actually, isn't the technology supposed to be our tool? Aren't we supposed to be in control of how we use the technology to improve and to change? So I think the technology won't disrupt in and of itself organically. I think we're going to have to create the momentum towards disruption. We're going to have to want to see a change in standards, a change in the way that we assess students. But understanding that, what we've done for hundreds of years in terms of our mathematics and science and English and African languages, that doesn't go away. That doesn't become less relevant. It doesn't mean that they're not subjects that are relevant in the fourth industrial revolution. We still need scientists, we still need engineers. What we're trying to do is transform access into outcomes, because at the moment, what we're really trying to focus on and how we solve this education sector to create democratic access, 100% access to everybody. But in doing so, are we diluting the quality of what we're delivering? And I say that insofar as saying we are negotiating with technology, but we are always on the losing end of the negotiation table. But we don't realize we're the master of technology. We're the ones who created it. And so we need to drive whatever technology is going to lead to better outcomes. Rob touched on redetermining what outcomes looks like. I think that we still do know what good outcomes are. I think whether or not assessment is benchmarking or reductive assessment, it ultimately provides us with a measure, a litmus test of what's going on in our schools and with our students. So even if we know what the standards are, we're still at the mercy of saying, well, we'll just retrofit technology into that model. So again, I kind of impeach to say, we need to think beyond hardware. We need to think beyond that we must just use whatever is freely available to us. And rather, we need to start redesigning what the model looks like. And then the technology must drive that change.
Earlier today, Corrin, we hosted the CEOs in part of the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation endowment sector, looking at the entrepreneurial mindset and how that can be best leveraged in schools and schooling. And what I'm hearing from you is less of we need to suddenly overhaul the Superman approach and completely change how we're using teaching and learning through technology, but rather starting from a very basic and appropriate perspective, what's relevant to that context. And that is, I think, an often overlooked perspective of what technology can bring and hinder in the process of learning and teaching. When you mentioned access being more important than outcomes, that's revolutionary to any westernized or traditional schooling system. What obstacles have you experienced, or challenges has your work experienced further beyond the obvious, of resistance to change or resistance to technology, and how did you work to overcome those?
Yeah. So, I mean, most people would probably expect me to quickly say, well, my biggest obstacle was the government departments. Actually, it wasn't. You know, I think that the government departments are right on the edge of wanting to see massive transformation in their schools and to support it. But we haven't created, in my mind, a scalable use case. We really haven't proven what works, what is the formula. Why? Because there is no one formula. You know, there is no one context, there is no one territory. Each province, each district, each household and each school, they're different. And so what we've found that we have to do is, ironically, is not a one size fits all. But isn't that actually what technology is supposed to be delivering, is a personalized education, right? And so we also have to see the deployment of technology in each of these schools and communities as a personalized deployment, just as teacher training and professional development needs to be personalized. So one of the major obstacles in my mind around the democratizing of education is actually that we dilute it so much that we say it's a one size fits all, first come, first served, and that's it. But actually, we need to be looking at transformation as a far more complex, long-term creature. And in doing that, we'll see far better outcomes. But the obstacle around that is not blaming the technology for not delivering our outcomes. I really think that that's going to be key as we go along this conversation.
Absolutely, Corrin. And I'm coming to you, Mokhudu, off the back of what Corrin has just said around personalized education. And that's often completely overlooked in standardized testing and benchmark testing and all other aspects of assessment in particular, just as you've said. And in a country like ours, having 11 different languages is the first aspect and descriptor of just how diverse our needs are from a learning and a teaching perspective. And Mokhudu, one of the questions dropped in the chat, but I know we're coming to questions in 3 minutes, but I'd like to bring this in now. Again, one of JGF's organizational values is working through the complexity to achieve simplicity. And alongside this, Mokhudu, what role, or rather, how do you see language as having a place in ICT/technology? How do you see them cohabitating in a very complex system and environment as South Africa, and yet with a sense of simplicity?
I would agree that a language will play a very vital role, and especially everyone speaking their language and implementing technology at the same time, because people will do better with something that they understand better, not to have to interpret it first before start implementing. I'm happy with programs like Scratch, wherein they are now including all these other languages. So personally, I'm doing that as curricula with my learners, and they are doing very well, the little ones, with the language they understand better. So they can use Scratch, they can create their own programs, and they have started coding. So I really love that. Maybe outside this question, what I can say as well is that when you implement what you can, and then you can be able to attract more stakeholders to come in and assist. And I'm happy to say now the department in my province have realized the importance of digital learning in the school, and they have donated laptops at my school for the learners to work it. And again, they also have selected the school as one of the piloting schools for robotics and coding. And remember, I'm speaking about the deep rural school, wherein there are so many challenges, the psychosocial challenges and stuff like that. But we are one of the piloting schools in the province, and UNISA is also supporting us with the robotics kits that they will be delivering at school in a few days.
Brilliant, Mokhudu. And in fact, you know, it's as if you could read my mind, because we're now moving to the questions and answers section from everyone who's watching. And we have both, of course, the Jakes Gerwel candidate fellows and community, but of course, this is live to a much larger audience. So I've got one immediately for you, Mokhudu, and then I've got one for you, Corrin, through the Zoom chat. So Juliet has a question, Mokhudu, particularly around robotics that you just mentioned. The question is, how can pedagogy move beyond a copy and paste of traditional teaching to integrate artificial intelligence, robotics, and prepare learners to meet the skills of the future?
Okay. Attempting to that question, I would say if you check our policies, let's go back to our CAPS policy document, the general aims. The one that I like the most, it says we need to equip our learners, irrespective of their socio-economic background, their race, their gender, their nationality, with knowledge and skills that are relevant for them to be relevant in the future. So that speaks volume. You look at the Agenda 2030, it speaks to what the question is saying. So we need to turn our pedagogy in such a way that we accommodate what is happening now from the way we used to teach in the past, and to making sure that we are teaching our learners today is going to benefit them in the future. Then with coding and robotics, we know that all the things that we are doing today are machinery. They are operating themselves. You order things online, apps that can do certain things and can be turned into robots and do work for whatever that you command them to do or you program them to do. So it is very, very important and very crucial that the pedagogy now needs to shift or be interrupted.
I love that use of the word, Mokhudu, of interrupted as a way to really demonstrate innovation. Thank you for answering Juliet's question so directly, Mokhudu. I have a question for you, Corrin, from Iviwe. He's referring back to the device dump problem, which is a term that we've used already. And he acknowledges that without teacher support in schools, and especially in rural schools, this device dump can be quite a challenge. However, with the incredibly exclusive nature of internet in this country, what is stopping us as a country from doing what other countries like Rwanda have done with the integration of ICT in schools?
Great, wonderful question. Interestingly, we actually work up in Rwanda as well with the Ministry of Education and the Rwanda Education Board. So we're very aware what Rwanda has done and the sort of progressive steps that it's made. But you know what Rwanda did was it accepted that internet could not be the determining factor about whether or not we had digital education. Now, I'm being very specific in saying digital education and not online education. There is a way for us to deliver very interactive assessment, data-driven content, as we do, in an offline environment or a hotspot-based environment. So I think that even though connectivity is getting better, I don't think in the next 5 to 7 years are we going to connect the devices that we have to internet. And so we must be solving around that problem rather than trying to take it head on and saying, well, we just need to improve connectivity before we can deliver a democratic education. But I think it also goes back to Mokhudu's point about, piloting. So Mokhudu is a perfect person I would want to reach out to and work with in a school. And if Mokhudu was the only teacher in the school who was working with the technology, she would be fantastic for us because that seeds and pilots and grows that pedagogy within other teachers. Peer learning occurs from a professional development point of view. So the number of times we arrive at schools, we are told that they've been deployed with the best devices in the country. They have not taken them out of the storeroom. They haven't been unpacked. And our implementation team ends up not training, but actually unpacking devices and trying to get them onto the network. Why is that? Because we don't have ownership of the programs, because we are constantly finding reasons that doesn't work. And so if we don't create those use cases, then schools say they've got other priorities. We see it as a supplementary add-on. We don't see it as core to our curriculum. I think what COVID is going to do in a post-COVID environment as well is really ring home to us why technology is so critical, why the devices coming into our schools can be transformed into outcomes. But we must make sure that as we're doing that, we're not using internet as an excuse, and we are looking constantly for how do we optimize the best use case to make it most valuable.
Agreed. And again, such good words coming out in terms of how we can best describe or interpret our current situation and how we can be quite interrupting of the status quo to be able to move it to the next and shift it to the next level. We've got just a few minutes left, but there are such interesting questions in our chat that I'm going to squeeze one more in, which I think is incredibly relevant and admittedly not discussed yet in this context. Hannah brings a very, very interesting point around online teaching or digital teaching, as you said, Corrin, to avoid that, to provide that distinction. And while, you know, part of their prompt goes, there are endless opportunities here, but it also raises issues about internet safety, plagiarism, and unreliable information. And thanks, Hannah, for not using the term fake news. Unreliable information is a lot more helpful. And this, you know, to allow a bit of organic aspects. Corrin, welcome to bring your voice in, and Mokhudu, and then we will close promptly at 6 o'clock.
So I'll jump in very quickly, because obviously this is an area that we particularly work in. So we create everything. We don't aggregate anybody's material for the very reasons that you've mentioned. So I think that we're going to move from this open educational resource or OER space to proprietary education products. Mokhudu's already using one of them in Minecraft as a Microsoft product. But I do think it's very important to be looking at the top shelf proprietary materials, because they are coming down in terms of price. Things do cost money, but in costing money, you can find some of the best resources. And so, you know, I think that we're constantly asked, oh, well, are we the same as Khan Academy or some YouTube videos? Well, some YouTube videos could be wrong. Some YouTube videos are inaccurate. And so we do have that danger we've got to look at. You know, proprietary materials and government being partnered with private sector to deliver those materials, I think, is the way of the future. And it's not going to be about relying on teachers or the internet to be our teachers or content writers, that we're going to be looking at the teachers can teach and the content deliverers and providers create the material for us.
Okay, let me also come in there. Yes, I will agree with Corrin with what he has just said, that let the content creators that will collaborate with the relevant stakeholders, which is the Department of Education, to deliver the content. But I would also like to urge that teachers need to be given that platform to create content for themselves, because really, I will give a practical example wherein the context is made from a different context with a learner. For example, maybe the context of that particular subject is being written on the basis of urban area, and there's a teacher who's teaching at the rural area, and they need to give an example, a direct example that the learners can relate directly with. So if the teachers will only look into that open education resource that has been provided from the service provider, but be given that opportunity to change and contextualize that and build the content, can share it on their platforms that they can create, blogs or website. And I also think that it's very crucial for teachers to learn the HTML language, where they can build their own website. As much as they are teaching, they are writing notes in notebooks, and then they shift from that perspective, and then they are able to create their own content.
I'm hearing a sense from both of you around empowerment and a sense of autonomy when dealing with the situation of how technology can interrupt and improve the quality of schools and schooling and teaching and learning in the various contexts that we describe. At JGF, we end on time, so we have just a few minutes before we close. And I want you, as speakers, Corrin and Mokhudu, before I thank you so profusely, I want to give you some insight into what's happening in the chat. So if I scroll a little bit up, and you have a +1, Corrin, around implementation often being an obstacle. Mokhudu, one of our candidate fellows, is arranging us to come and visit your school without us even having any influence there. We are now suddenly coming your way, of course, pandemic accommodating. But most important is, Solo mentioned we need a part 2 of the session. And that, for me, is such a great indicator of the quality of the insights that all 3 speakers today have brought of their different levels of pathways of innovation, disruption, innovation, and all those words that speak to the same goal. But most importantly, everyone attending this session, as Julian mentioned, is that they are part 2. Is that it's not necessarily that we actually have to have the session again, but rather Corrin, Mokhudu, and Rob, who's left already, You've planted a seed and you've given us a language of description on how to manage and deal with technology as a pre-service teacher for some of the context here, as an existing teacher in my case, and as the work we do, that was my computer, as we do the different work that we do at the Jake Schiavone Fellowship. So a profound and a real sense of gratitude to Corrin and Mokhudu for your time, firstly. If anything, this pandemic has proved how precious our time is, but also to thank you for the work that you were doing and leading change in the contexts that matter. Thank you very much.